All right, so today's lesson we're going to do 12.1, which is functions involving square roots. For 12.1 to 12.4, it's all about square roots, okay? We've dealt with these before, and who can tell me, what is that sign called? What's its real name?
A radical.
A radical, very good. You may want to write this down because that's what we're going to be calling it, the radical. I want you to get used to not the square root sign, but I want you to get used to its real name, which is a radical, okay? Now, before when we dealt with radicals, what do I know can never be underneath a radical? A negative number. So if I got the square root of -2, there is no such thing as the square root of -2. It's actually called an imaginary number. You're not going to have to deal with those until you get into Algebra 2 or Trig, okay? So we're not, no matter what, I know I cannot have a negative number underneath my radical sign. And that's what we're going to be most concerned with today. Okay? So in this first example, all they want us to do is list the domain. The domain, okay, you're probably going to want to write this down, is the x values. So I would write down somewhere that you see that the domain is all x values. All x values, okay? So what they want us to find out is what can x equal, okay? I know no matter what, I cannot have a negative number underneath the radical. So as long as whatever's underneath the radical is 0 or bigger, I'm good to go. I'm in business, okay? But if it's a negative number, I know that it cannot be, that's not going to work out for me. I can't have a negative number underneath there. So what I need to do is I need to ask myself, underneath the radical, how do I make it a 0? Anytime, okay, what does x have to equal in order for it to be a 0? Anytime that x is the only thing underneath the radical, the only thing, like in this problem right here, x is the only thing underneath the radical. It does not matter that there's a 2 here. Okay, if I had a problem that looked like this, square root of x, minus 3. What's the only thing underneath the radical? The x. As long as x is the only thing underneath the radical, as long as x is greater than or equal to 0, then that's going to be my domain. X can be any number that's greater than or equal to 0. So if you look right here, I can plug this in. 2 times the square root of 0 is 0, okay? 2 times the square root of 1 is 2. All right, I can keep going. As long as my numbers are larger than 0, then I know that that's what that is. So as long as what's underneath the radical is 0 or bigger, then that is going to be my domain, okay? Now, what about when I have something like this? I've got to figure out what x is going to equal in order for there to be a 0 under the radical. Because I know as long as my end product is a 0, whatever x equaled, okay, x is bigger than this, then I'm fine. So I've got to ask myself, what plus 5 equals 0? Think about it. What do I need to add to 5 in order to equal 0? Negative 5. So as long as x is greater than or equal to negative 5, then that's going to be my domain. Because I can plug in any number that's bigger than negative 5, and I know I'll always end up with either 0 or a positive number underneath that radical. But think about it. If I were to plug in the square root of, let's say, negative 6 plus 5, what would I get? Negative 1. Can I have that? No. So I know as long as x is greater than or equal to negative 5, then I know exactly what I can plug in for x. Okay, so let's look at this next one. What do I have to subtract with 10 in order to get 0? 10. So as long as x is greater than 10, I'll never have a negative number underneath the radical. Okay? Now, this is a tricky one because people go, what? Hold on a second. What do I need to, it's tricky, but it's very easy. What do I need to multiply with 2 to get 0? What's negative 2 times 2? Negative 4. So I need to multiply 0. So as long as x is greater than or equal to 0, then I know I'll never have a negative number. Because look, if I were to do 2 times 0, what does that equal? 0. 2 times 1, 2. So as long as every number is bigger than 0, I'll never get a negative number. Now, let's look at this one really quick. What would I have to multiply 3/4 by to get 0? 0. Exactly. Okay, so as long as x is equal to 0 or greater than or equal to 0, then I'm fine. It does not matter if it's a fraction, if it's a decimal, if it's a negative number, okay? As long as whatever I multiply it with gets 0, then that is my answer, okay? All right, so let's look at this next one. This next one I've got more than one step. I've got to figure out what can I multiply 6 by that's going to give me a number that's going to be equal to or bigger than 18. Okay, 3. So this is how you do this, though. If you start and you realize, I don't know, just start with 1. 6 times 1 is 6. So 6 minus 18 is going to be negative 12. So I know it can't be 1. Okay, whoops. All right, we try 2. 6 times 2 minus 18. 12. 12 minus 18 is negative 6. So I know, still not working. All right, I'm going to go bigger. 6 times 3 is 18. 18 minus 18 is 0. So as long as whatever I plug in for x is bigger than or equal to 3, then I know that's my domain. So x has got to be greater than or equal to 3. Okay? And lastly, now look at this problem. This problem is different than the others because I have 5 minus x. That x is at the end of the problem, okay? 5 is being subtracted from x. Or I'm sorry, x is being subtracted from 5. So I've got to ask myself, normally I would say, oh, okay, 5 minus 5 is 0. So as long as x is greater than 5. But let's try that. Let's try a bit number bigger than 5. What's 5 minus 6? Negative 1. So that's not going to work, whatever's bigger than 5. What I got to know is whenever x is in the back, okay, or behind a number and it's being subtracted, I have to use the less than or equal to sign. I've got to use the less than or equal to sign. So I still say, okay, 5 minus what equals 0? 5. But x is going to have to be less than or equal to 5. Because watch, let's think of a number that's less than 5. What about negative 1? Okay, 5 minus negative 1 is what? What do those two negative signs do? Add together and give me a 6. Okay, does that make sense? Do you understand why it has to be less than? All right. All right, so example number 2, what they want me to do is they want me to graph this, and they want me to find the domain and the range. First of all, we've already said that the domain is all of the x values. So what do you think that the y is? I mean, what do you think the range is? Y. All the y values, okay? So the domain, I'm just going to write it again, is all x values. And the range is all y values. Now, we have to be pretty specific with x because that determines whether or not it's going to work because I'm dealing with square roots. So I need to know that x has got to be greater than or equal to this number, or it has to be less than or equal to this number. So I know if I plug in something bigger than that or smaller than that, it's not going to work. Or it is going to work, depending on what number it is, okay? Now the range, we have a little more leeway because it's basically what this equation right here is equal to. That's what my range is. And the range, okay, I'm not going to be so specific. I'm not going to say y has to equal this or y has to be greater than or equal to this. I'm just going to say either y is all positive numbers. Okay, if I look and I see that I've got negative and positive numbers, y is all real numbers because positive and negative numbers are considered real numbers, okay? Or y is all negative numbers, okay? That is just a very vague description of the range. I don't need specific numbers, okay? But before I can find the range, before I can graph this, I've got to know my domain. So I ask myself, what do I have to plug in for x in order for it to equal 0? No, I'm just looking for x. Because basically what I have to look for is I'm only concerned with what is underneath the radical. Right now, that -2 means nothing to me. I'm only concerned with a number underneath the radical. So what can I plug in here so that I have a 0 underneath the radical? 0. So as long as x is greater than or equal to 0, then I can plug in any number. Now watch, because a lot of people go, but hold on, the square root of 0 minus 2 is going to be 0 minus 2, which equals -2. You get a negative number. But is that negative number underneath the radical? No. Look right here. I had 0, the square root of 0. Can I work that? Yeah, the square root of 0 is 0. Okay? What about the square root of 1? Will that work? Square root of 1 is 1. 1 minus 2 is equal to -1. Okay? So as long as the number underneath the radical is larger than 0 or bigger, then I'm fine. It has nothing to do with what's on the outside of the radical, either before it or behind it. Okay? And basically, a really easy shortcut to memorize that, as long as x is the only thing underneath the radical, it's always going to be x is greater than or equal to 0. As long as it's the only thing underneath the radical. Okay? So now, I need to graph this. And in order to graph this, I know my domain, which is all my x values. So I have to know the x values so I can plug them in to get the y values. So I want to make an x and y chart. Okay? Now, on your x and y chart, you always want to use 4 values. You don't need to use more than 4 values. You cannot use less than 4 values. It has to be 4. And I know my domain has got to be, or the x's have got to be 0 or anything bigger. So I start with 0. 1, 2, and 3. There's 4 values, all numbers that are larger than 0. That's what I always like to do. I like to start with x has to be greater than or equal to that number, and that's the number that I start with. Then all you got to do is plug it in and solve for y. So I say, okay, we kind of just did this one. Square root of 0 minus 2 is going to be 0 minus 2, which is -2. So y is going to equal -2. Okay? Now I have the square root of 1 minus 2 equals 1 minus 2, which is -1. Then I plug in 2. Square root of 2 minus 2. Now somebody tell me, whenever you plug that in your calculator, what are you going to get? When you plug it in, your calculator should say this. You do square root 2, and then you have to press the over arrow, okay, over to the right, so that the -2 or whatever you're subtracting does not go underneath the radical, because in this problem, it's not underneath the radical. So I put -2, then I press equals, and my calculator tells me -2 plus the square root of 2. Now, how am I going to find that on a graph? I'm probably not. It's too hard. So all I've got to do is change it to a decimal. So if you have the blue and white calculator, it's just the arrows that point outside. If you have the Casio, you use the S to D. And once you do that, I get -0.58. And what I want to do is I want to round to the nearest tenth. So I need one decimal place. So if it's 0.58, I know that's going to be -0.6 because I use that 8 to round up. So let's do the last one. So I plug that in and I get the square root of 3 minus 2. and I'm going to get, in decimal form, negative 0.26. So if I round that, I'm going to have negative 0.3. So now what I need to do is I need to actually graph this. So this is where you're going to get out your graph paper, and I'm going to graph it. All right, the first point that I'm going to plot is 0, negative 2. So I go to 0 on the x-axis and negative 2 on the y. Then I'm going to go over to 1, down to negative 1. Then I'm going to go over to 2, down to negative 0.6. Okay, now you're going to need to get it as close as possible. Obviously, it doesn't have to be perfect. And then 3 and negative 0.3. Again, as close as possible. It doesn't have to be perfect. Now, what it's going to do is it's going to be a curved line. You're always going to have a curved line. Now, if I were to keep plugging in values, let's say I did 4 for x and 5 for x and 6 for x, and I kept going, this line would keep going up into the positive numbers, right? So y is not always going to be, even though the 4 values that we have chosen, it's always negative, it's not always going to be negative, okay? So, before we do that, or after I just said that, hold on 1 second. We'll come back to that in a minute. In order to draw your line through these points, because you can't just leave them as dots, I've got to draw a line through it. What do I know x cannot be smaller than? 0. So I know I have to start my line from there. And it's not going to go below this. I'm not going to use an arrow and I'm not going to go below it because I know that x is never going to be a negative number. So it's never going to be over on that side of the equation or the graph. So that's how you draw your line. You do it from your start point and you go whichever way your dots are going. Now, I need to list my range. I've already listed my domain, which is x is greater than or equal to 0. This was the domain. Now I need to list the range. And I look and I see, okay, right now it looks like the range is all negative numbers. But I said if I were to keep doing numbers on the x-axis, like 4, 5, 6, those y values would go into a positive number. So I know that my range is all real numbers. Anytime I know it's going to be positive and negative numbers, I just say all real numbers. Now, if it would have started at negative 2 and it would have gone negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, I know it's never going to go above negative 2. So I know it's always going to stay in the negatives. My line would have looked something like this. Okay, it's never going to go above this and it's always going to keep going below. So that would have been all negative numbers. Okay? All right, so last example, example number 3. Okay, again, they want us to graph and list the domain and range. So before I can do anything, I've got to figure out what my domain is going to be. So I've got to ask myself, okay, what is going to subtract with 3 in order to get 0? What would I have to plug in for x in order for x minus 3 to be 0? 3. So I know that my domain has got to be x is going to have to be anything bigger than 3. So x is greater than 3. So now on my x and y chart, what number am I going to start with? 3. And I'm going to list 4 values. So 3, 4, 5, 6, because I know x has got to be greater than 3. Excuse me. Okay, now I just plug it in and solve for y. Now this problem is a little bit different because everything is underneath the radical. So 3 minus 3 is 0. The square root of 0 is 0. Then I do the square root of 4 minus 3. 4 minus 3 is the square root of 1, which is 1. Then I have 5 minus 3, and I get the square root of 2. Well, I know there's no exact number that's the square root of 2, so I plug it in my calculator, and I get square root of 2, and I press enter, and it's going to give me the square root of 2. So I have to change it to a decimal, which is 1.4. And then lastly, I've got square root of 6 minus 3, which is the square root of 3. Again, I know there's no exact square root of 3, so I plug it in my calculator, change it to a decimal, and I get 1.7. Now, let's look at these values, and let's list our range before we even graph it. What is my range going to be? I've got three options: all positive, all negative, or all real numbers. So I look. All positive, because it starts at 0 and it goes up. It's never going to go below 0. So I can say my range is all positive numbers. All right, so now let's graph this. So I first go over to 3 because I know my first x value is 3. So I go over 3 and up 0 because my first y value is 0. Okay, then I go over to 4, up 1. Then I go over to 5 and up 1.4. Again, get it as close as you can. And over to 6 and up 1.7. I notice it's a curved line. I always have to start at the dot that I started with. I never want to go below it. And I draw my line up. Okay, I've got my domain and range listed here. And I've got my graph. All right? So just remember, the most important thing to remember here is what can never be underneath the radical? A negative number. So in order to find my domain, which is the most important thing, I've got to figure out, okay, underneath the radical, I need it to at least equal 0. So I've got to figure out what x is going to become.